ideas, metaphysical ideas, tend to transmit rather more slowly than ideas that might have some economic advantage. So it's really in the 11th century that European theology, philosophical theology, really starts to grapple with ideas from the Arabs. And this is probably more important than any of the other percolations that I've been discussing. And it was made possible not primarily by the Arab conquests, but by the Christian reconquests. It was only when Christians found them ruling substantial areas that had been culturally transformed by Islam that the Christians were able to learn substantially from the Arabic intellectual tradition and started the task of translating Arabic text into Latin. But to understand that process, we have to backtrack substantially and look at how Arabic philosophy and philosophical theology had themselves emerged. I mentioned very briefly last week the Mu'tazilites, who are regarded as the first rationalizing theologians in Islam, although that's not quite right. Mu'tazilites. They're certainly the first to attempt a systematic theology. Later on, Sunni Asharism does the same thing. And I mentioned that now we don't quite believe that the early Mu'tazilites were influenced by the Hellenistic traditions of southern Mesopotamia, but this represents an indigenous Islamic growth, importing categories of substance and accident from the categories of Arabic grammar. Now, what kind of intellectual universe did the Arabs find themselves ruling, and what were the channels by which they were able to integrate aspects of that intellectual patrimony into the Islamic story? Sometimes, again, in the West, we tend to think that Greek philosophy reached its climax with Aristotle and then sort of deteriorated into various Neoplatonic speculations and superstitions. Now that view is increasingly challenged by the work of people like Richard Sorabji, who have shown the originality and brilliance of the Alexandrian Middle Platonic tradition. There's a lot more interest in the Neoplatonists than there used to be. But we do have this image of the Byzantines drawing a line under classical Greek thought by Justinian, who closes Plato's Academy in Athens and bans all pagan, not specifically Christian, philosophical instruction in the empire, and the burning of the library in Alexandria by the Emperor Theodosius. This is part of the famous Edict of Theodosius, which bans the practice of paganism in the Roman Empire, and the library is burnt at that time. And in a sense, those two symbolic events do represent the end of an age. But the story really isn't as simple as that, because when the Arabs emerge on the scene a couple of centuries later, they actually find the legacy of the Greeks very much alive, and not just in Christianized forms. In the first instance, Christianity, while banning pagan philosophy, had quite early on integrated many of the categories of Greek, particularly Platonic thought, into its theology. The new Muslim territories really included all of the significant centers of this Hellenized Christian learning. Still at that time, Byzantium and Rome were very insignificant philosophical and theological centers. The great intellectual powerhouses of Christendom were all in the areas that the Muslims had conquered. In Alexandria, there was a very famous school of Christian philosophy. Under Muslim rule, this actually moved to Syria and then to Baghdad for various reasons. It wasn't closed, but it migrated generally towards larger cities. Alexandria declined following the foundation of Fustat that became Cairo, and so this Christian academy moved. But it continued its work and interacted constantly with the Muslim population which surrounded it. Another center, less familiar perhaps, was a city called Harran, which is now more or less on the southern borders of Turkey. And here you have a curious sect called the Sabians, who like to identify themselves with the Sabians mentioned in the Quran, who I mentioned yesterday. And they cultivated what was really still a pagan form of Neoplatonism. And when Baghdad starts to flourish as the intellectual center of the Muslim empire, these people, far from feeling challenged by this Muslim orthodoxy, actually move into the center of intellectual life. And so this academy moves from Harran to Baghdad. Further east in Iran, before the rise of Islam, there had been a very major center of learning in a city called Jundishapur. And surprisingly, perhaps, the learning of the major colleges in Sassanid Iran was very heavily Hellenized. Following the conquest of Alexander the Great, Aristotle's teachings had taken firm root throughout the Iranian world and were cultivated not in independent philosophical schools, but in medical colleges, because the principal vocational application of the Greek learning was in medicine. Jundishapur contained what was, for the first couple of centuries of Islam, the great center of medical learning in Islam, and that was associated with the teaching of philosophy, usually by Nestorian Christians. Now, the early Muslims ruling this area became quite fascinated by this intellectual heritage, and with what is really remarkable spirit of generosity, no doubt informed in part by the religion itself, but also by the fact that they felt so confident they were really rulers of the world and didn't feel threatened at all by these minority traditions. They started deliberately to translate texts from Greek and also from Syriac into Arabic. And we can say that before the Enlightenment, this is the most conspicuous incidence in world history of one civilization deliberately setting out to learn from another. The process seems to have begun about 100 years after the Hijrah, the process of translation, but begins in earnest with the foundation by the early Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun of an institution in his capital of Baghdad called the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Learning, the House of Wisdom. If you look at that PBS film, you'll see a discussion of it and a dramatic reconstruction. First translations were made through the intermediary of Syriac, which was quite a useful, already Hellenized Semitic language, and was the principal language of the Hellenized Christians, particularly in Syria, but also Mesopotamia. It was the usual language of philosophical discussion amongst Christians in the Near East. So the early translators at this Bayt al-Hikmah were actually not Muslims, but they were Christians, usually Syriac Christians, employed by the Caliph. And the most distinguished of these was an Nestorian by the name of Hunayn ben Ishaq, who dies in 873. And Hunayn is a hugely impressive scholar, not least because he is aware of the necessity of establishing a critically edited text before translation can be undertaken. So what he does is, personally or through his amanuensis, to search the libraries of the philosophical schools and monasteries, not just in the Islamic world, but also in the Byzantine Empire, in order to find the oldest existing stable texts of Plato and particularly Aristotle. He was interested in medicine. A lot of his first translations were from Hippocrates and Galen. But he also translates some of the key works of Plato, including the Timaeus and the Republic, also the logical works of Aristotle, the least controversial aspect of Greek thought to be imported into Arabic. The least religiously problematic for the Muslims was medicine and also logic. So Aristotle's Organon, his great logical tract, gets done into Arabic very early. Also Euclid, his mathematical and geometrical treatises get done into Arabic. So the Caliphate commissions translations of virtually everything that the Greeks had done, with only one significant exception, which was poetics, partly because poetics is closely linked to the particularities of the Greek language. It became clear that that wouldn't work particularly well in Arabic translation. And also Greek drama was never really done into Arabic. The Arabs never developed a theatrical tradition. But everything else was done into Arabic, and particularly medicine and also astronomy. The reason for the interest in medicine is obvious. The Prophet himself had been a healer there are whole books of prophetic medicine which list hadiths showing the usually herbal remedies which the Prophet would use to relieve his companions of various ailments. So a prestigious science. Astronomy and also the related science of mathematics was also, interestingly, required for religious reasons. One of these reasons was that as this empire expanded gigantically, methods had to be developed for determining the direction of prayer, which could entail quite complex considerations of spherical trigonometry. One of the most prominent scholars at the Dar al-Hikmah Academy was a Central Asian called Khwarizmi, indicating that he's from Khwarazm. There's still a province of Uzbekistan today called Khwarazm. It's on the south coast of the Aral Sea, but basically it was wiped out by the Mongols and hasn't recovered. But in that period, it was one of the great intellectual centers of Islamic civilization. Khwarizmi is from there. He dies sometime around the middle of the 9th century. And of course, from his name, we get the English word algorithm, beloved of computer geeks everywhere. Algorithm comes from al-Khwarizmi. One of the things he did was to provide the caliph with new and more accurate versions of the old Indian astronomical tables. But really his chief claim to fame lies in the realm of mathematics. One of his textbooks is widely regarded as the world's first systematic treatment of algebra. Algebra from the Arabic al-jabr. You may recall from my lecture on theology last week that jabr was the term which the Muslims use for the idea of predestination, from which the Asharis distance themselves. It means compulsion. So the two sides of an equation have a kind of logical, necessary relationship with each other, hence this word is used for algebra. Also, al-Khwarizmi is one of the first figures, although getting back to the earlier question, probably not the first to deal systematically with the new Indian numerals. One of the things that Khwarizmi does, though, using these numerals, and some of his pupils also, is to make a number of major mathematical breakthroughs, one of which is the method of finding the square root of a number. He was the first to crack that. We also find one of his pupils, called al-Uqlidi, which simply means the Euclidean. He seems to have been the first person ever to have used decimal fractions. But possibly the most impressive of these Arabic contributions to mathematics was by somebody called Ibn al-Haytham. Ibn al-Haytham dies in 1039. Over 50 of his books have survived. And the most famous is called the Kitab al-Manazir, or the Book of Optics, later translated into Latin as the Opticae Thesaurus, which was the main text for optics in medieval Europe. And one of the major innovations in the book was that he didn't just base himself on theory, but also on experimentation and observation. One of his major discoveries was the fact that certainly the Greeks had never suspected, which is that light travels from an object to the eye, rather than rays going from the eye to the object, which was what Aristotle had thought. He's a keen experimenter. He has a laboratory in Baghdad, and he's the first to have carried out experiments with the behavior of convex lenses, parabolic mirrors. He also worked quite exhaustively on problems of the refraction of light through transparent media, and was also able to attempt a calculation of the height of the Earth's atmosphere. I'm going to have to skip some of these astronomers. Yeah. These are translated into Europe in the 12th century, and it's interesting that those areas of the Greek heritage that most unproblematically flowed into the Islamic world, astronomy and medicine, also tend to be those areas that are most rapidly and unproblematically translated from Arabic into Latin for comparable reasons. So astronomy and medicine go into Europe relatively early, basically in the 12th and the 13th century, often through Jewish translators. The Jews travelling back and forth between the two worlds often knew Arabic as well as Latin. Yes, I've got some material here on medicine that I will defer, I think, except to point out that in Cambridge until the 17th century, the principal medical textbook was actually the canon of Avicenna, the great 11th century Persian philosopher and also medical writer. The great hospitals of the Islamic world, which contained teaching facilities, dispensaries, often very large institutions, up to 5,000 patients with different wards for those afflicted with different ailments. No comparable institutions developed in Europe until about the 13th century. The first teaching hospitals in Europe apparently didn't really emerge until the mid-16th century. Yes, this is all medicine. Let me get back to philosophy and theology, which accompanies all of this and comes through the initiative of the Dar al-Hikmah. You find in Islamic civilization, from about the 10th century on, sometimes tense bifurcation between two, well, we would regard them both as forms of theology because they're both ultimately about God, that adopted rather different attitudes towards the Greek heritage. On the one hand, you had the Kalam, which we treated briefly last week, which is the formal, dogmatic, systematic theology of the religion. And coexisting uneasily with it was something called the falsafa. Obviously the word is Greek origin, which is a kind of philosophy. By this time, a rather sophisticated synthesis that had already come into existence at the hand of Christian thinkers between the thought of Plato, Aristotle, and the Neoplatonists. So the Arabs were reading Plato and Aristotle primarily through the spectacles of these late Christian, usually Syriac thinkers, one of whose assumptions was very often that Plato and Aristotle were actually saying the same things in different ways, which of course is not the case. So the Kalam theologians, through Ash'ari and leading on to Shahrastani, who dies in 1153, import a lot of the Greek methods and styles of argument that they thought were useful, particularly Aristotle's modal logic, and certain metaphysical distinctions also form part and parcel of the Kalam. Also, to some extent, cosmological arguments for the existence of God come from the Greeks into Muslim theology. But the more thoroughgoing exponents of the Hellenistic legacy were the Falasifa, the people of Falsafa. And the first great exponent of this in the East was somebody called Al-Farabi, who dies in 950. Farabi is actually a Turk from Central Asia. And a bit later, the even more luminous figure of Ibn Sina, who dies in 1037. In Latin, Alfarabius and Avicenna. And these two men are working with the philosophical synthesis of late antiquity. They knew some of the late Hellenistic texts, and thanks to the efforts of the translators at the Dar al-Hikmah, they have access to the original works of Plato and also Aristotle, which the Middle Platonists and certainly the Christian theologians generally didn't have access to. But they weren't just the sort of parrots of Greek thought. They developed it quite substantially. While very controversially for Muslims, they accepted the idea of emanation rather than creation, and a kind of mystical vision of ascent to the One. They nonetheless remained faithful Muslims in that they rejected many aspects of Plotinus's thought, particularly what is in effect his polytheism and the thaumaturgy, the sort of magical rituals that were associated with late pagan Greek philosophy. Obviously there's a tension between these two intellectual traditions. The Kalam theologians become the guardians of normative Islamic belief. The Falasifa are always regarded with a good deal of suspicion, although they're also respected because these are powerful intellects, particularly Avicenna. And the clash between them comes to a head in the writings of Al-Ghazali, who dies in 1111, who has a superlative intellect and reads the works of Ibn Sina, and one of his principal objectives in life is to show the superiority of Islamic theology over the Greeks. And he does this in one of the classic works of Islamic philosophy or theology, called the Tahafut al-Falasifa, which has been done into English. Amy will be pleased to note that it was done at Brigham Young University, of all places. Very good translation. And what it means is the incoherence of the philosophers. And Ghazali's strategy is not to refute the philosophers using proof texts from the Quran and the Hadith, because he recognizes that they're really thoroughgoing rationalists and they're only going to accept their own kind of debate. And so he uses, very brilliantly, the Greek intellectual arguments to show that on their own terms, the Arab philosophers have got it wrong. And he says that on 3 doctrinal issues, these falasifa have to be declared outside the pale of Islam. He acknowledges, as the Ash'ari tradition generally does, that one of the hardest things a theologian can do is to prove that somebody is not a Muslim. He says that's extraordinarily difficult. But he says that in the case of the falasifa, there are 3 issues where they have to be regarded as disastrously in error. And those 3 areas are: Avicenna held that the world is uncreated. It represents the manifestation of God's possibilities. Therefore, it always has to have existed as a permanent emanation from the One. Clearly, however you look at it, that can't be squared with the Quranic idea of a creation of the world ex nihilo, creation in time. So he says this cannot be regarded as a Muslim belief. And using the same kind of argument, Avicenna also held, with the Neoplatonists, that the world is eternal, goes on forever, because God never stops manifesting, and hence being what he is. And therefore, just as the sun is no longer the sun if it stops shining, God could no longer be God if he stops manifesting the world. And this clearly clashes with the Quranic doctrine of the Day of Judgment, the end of the world. And the third argument is that following the Greeks, Avicenna and these controversial, very influential, very brilliant Arab philosophers had also denied something called God's knowledge of particulars. They held that the One could only be diminished if he actually knew, or if it actually knew, all of the little things that happen in the world. All that God, the One, knows is that there is a prime mover that emanates from the One. They thought that his essence would be made multiple if it included a multiplicity of knowledges. So they with basically following the Neoplatonists, assumed that there was one creative demiurge, rather akin to the Jewish idea of Metatron that I discussed last night. And Ghazali correctly says this is not the God of Abraham and the Quran. That doesn't look like God at all. That's a God that doesn't really have much power or even much knowledge. And therefore, on that issue as well, he said that these people are outside the pale of Islam. But his arguments against them are very important and influential, because he doesn't just chuck scriptural proof texts against them, as earlier Muslim theologians had done. He shows that on their own terms, it doesn't make sense. And just to give you a brief example of how that works, Avicenna, following the Greeks, had held that the created universe is of finite extent, and that change and decay takes place in the sublunary sphere, that is, below the orbit of the moon, and is influenced by the orbit of the moon and the higher spheres until you get to God. And he also held, with the Greeks, that the soul, because it is a substance, occupies space. And Ghazali says, here we have a contradiction, because how can you believe that a finite space is the location of the infinite generation of finite objects, namely souls? If there's an infinite accumulation of finite objects inside a finite space, sooner or later the sublunary sphere is going to get full. And in fact, because on the Greek argument it had always existed, that doesn't actually make sense. It's a logical incoherence. And that argument finds its way also into Aquinas and Bonaventure and medieval Christian thought, and forms part of the Latin Christian argument against Plato and the Neoplatonists. That's just to give you one example. There's a lot of other very sophisticated arguments. And this is possibly the high point of Muslim theology, in the Middle Ages at any rate. Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa. And so successful is he that the Falasifa tradition after his day kind of gives up. There are other reasons why the pure Hellenistic tradition starts to wither in later Islamic civilization. But one of the principal reasons is that Ghazali actually deals at a death blow by showing that even on its own terms, it simply doesn't add up. It doesn't work. However, that's not the end of Greek thought, because you have, after Ibn Sina, you have Ibn Rushd. I hope I've got his date somewhere. Ibn Rushd, of course, of Cordoba, who is Averroes. For Europe, even more influential than Ibn Sina, partly because he's really into Aristotle, and Aquinas thought that Aristotle was much more interesting than Plato for various reasons. So in Aquinas' great work, which is the great intellectual monument of medieval Christendom, the Summa Theologica, you find that he talks about the philosopher, by whom he means Aristotle, and the commentator, by whom he means Averroes, or Ibn Rushd of Cordoba. Ibn Rushd does this very strange thing of writing a long commentary, a medium commentary, and a short commentary on all of Aristotle's metaphysical works, and these go into Latin, become very influential. Ibn Rushd is after Ghazali, but is really, and he tries to write a refutation of the Tahafut, but it's generally not terribly successful. But that's not to say that the Hellenistic tradition, or rationalism, dies in the Islamic world because of the triumph of religious obscurantism, or whatever the traditional stereotype would be. In fact, Ghazali does more than anybody to internalize it and to digest it within the framework of the Kalam. Ghazali himself, and also his teacher Al-Juwayni, one of the great luminaries of Ash'ari thought, had incorporated large swathes of Greek thought, particularly Aristotelian thought, categories and the modal logic, into Islamic philosophical theology. So on the one hand, while they reject the Falasifa, on the other hand, they are making Kalam theology much more Hellenistic than it had ever been hitherto, but filtering out carefully those aspects of it that clearly couldn't be acceptable to an Abrahamic religious perspective.